Hey, how's it going?
Hello.
Hey, it's good to see you. Thanks for joining.
Hi.
Hey, Adam. Hey, Mara. Good to see you back from vacation.
Hey, yeah, I'm happy to be here again. I think I need like another 3-week vacation to recover from my vacation. It wouldn't be that bad.
Sure. All right, should we get started? I don't know if that was obvious. There's an agenda document where we keep the questions, and Adam has the first two topics. Would you like to verbalize that?
Yeah, just real quick. So when we rolled out 12.5, of course, during the deployment, the migrations have been executed first. And since we have one single database between Canary and production, actually a database migration broke an existing and working database query from 12.4. And this was failing loading like the security scan results until we actually officially released 12.5. And the culprit, I think Andreas linked it. And I also in the merge request, it was, I think, because the query used basically a string as a select statement. So we didn't reference the table relation directly. We just put the column name there. And as soon as the migration happened with the same column name in a join table, the query failed because the query planner couldn't decide which table to use. And here it's coming in that, hey, how much SQL, pure SQL should we use in the queries? Should we always try to enforce that, hey, even if it's a straightforward select statement or a straightforward expression, should we enforce to use RL or active record if it's possible to give the list of columns?
I think in general, I'd agree that it's always good to be explicit with table names because of that. I don't know if we needed to enforce RL over SQL. I would love if we can retain the ability to write SQL ourselves. Does that make sense? But
well, I wouldn't say restrict the writing pure SQL, but when it's needed, we should be as explicit as possible about the column names. And this specific error, it probably it was a really hard catch. I mean, we didn't catch it during review, and it's a really edge case, right? Because what are the chances?
Yeah, for sure. And in that sense, it's also interesting to look at the testing that we do. I think if I understand that correctly, then basically running the migrations while the old version of the code was live basically caused that problem, and that is something that you can't test for when you only run the tests on one version of your application. So I think this also goes back to testing no downtime upgrades, which is something we don't do to my knowledge. So our testing basically goes like, run all the pending migration, or basically run all the migrations. And then with the current version that you're testing on, run all the tests. And if we had something that was basically testing for the no downtime steps, we would need to be doing things like running with the previous version, applying the migrations, and then running the tests on that, right? Before we go on and run the tests on the new version. And then there's the same issue with the post-deploy migrations, I guess. So that's a little bit maybe too extensive to test.
Yeah, but that actually would have caught the issue. And I mean, it shouldn't be part of the main pipeline. Maybe when it's merged to master, it would be kicked off. It's basically doubles the test runtime because you have to test it twice, only with migrations, and the other one is the new code. Yeah.
I think it really gets you into the woods with testing no downtime migrations, because I think we also don't limit the versions that you can upgrade from. So I think you have to do some. You may have to do multiple major upgrades if you're too far behind, but then you can basically upgrade from any minor version to any other minor version in the same major version, and stuff like that. So there's, if you think about the ultimately the amount of paths that you would have to test for, that you would have to cover, those are like really quite a lot, I guess. But yeah, I mean, we've had similar issues before where if we had that kind of testing going on, we would have saved ourselves, because we do actually do no downtime upgrades, and we're sort of facing the risk of running into these issues too if we don't have the proper testing for that. But yeah, I mean, coming back to the actual issue, being explicit with tables is always good. Did you have ideas how to enforce it?
Well, we could add it to the documentation, of course, in the database review guidelines. So just to have it noted. Mm-hmm. Maybe, I mean, for a specific select, we could probably catch it with Rubocop. This particular case, when a string is passed into the select colon active record, we could catch that.
What did you mean with string is passed into that?
So in Rubocop, you can have a rule that, hey, catch all the select methods, and then when a string is passed as the only argument, then we can be sure that there might be some problems. No, not really, because if the table name is specified, then we wouldn't be able to detect that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, but it's because Active Record basically doesn't care. It's not that you have like two parameters for that, so you just pass in a string.
Yeah.
At the same, I think it's also difficult to detect when you think about really custom SQLs where you write a bunch of SQL, you include that in some other Active Record query. It's quite hard to detect from a static analysis point of view. But on the other hand, if we run a lot of tests, so we might be able to see the full queries that we run, but then parsing those and making sure that we have explicit names could also be difficult. Or maybe not, balance out with the benefit.
Yeah, I don't think we can write a rule that always reliably fails. Maybe like a warning thing that, hey, you might have some strings attached with the strings passed without the table name, so it's not explicit. Look at those. Make sure it's you specify the table name, but I'm not sure we can have an exact check for it.
Mm-hmm.
Perhaps we could build like a rake task that prints the attributes that are repeated across tables and then build something on top of that. But that might be also complicated. Like I see it like in different stages, because as Andrea said, checking that with the static analysis might be a little bit tricky.
Yeah, and you might have aggregations. Like if you do an average, then it's more difficult to parse.
What's wrong with just having the suggestion here of table name dot column name? I think that solves the dynamic version of the issues, like whenever you have dynamic name column names coming up, or static. Is there any? Sorry, I missed the first part of the meeting a bit.
Yeah, we were thinking about automating this check. So we write some kind of automation that automatically detects this stuff, so we reviewers and maintainers don't have to actually always check for this specific case.
Yeah. I mean, you agreed on table name dot column name syntax. I think it's good. I mean, just like it's required.
That's right. It's always good to be explicit with those. And that avoids those issues. But the question is really how would we sort of detect that if we can? But it seems a little bit tricky.
Actually, we are lucky that Active Record always generates the plural form of the long table name, and thanks to Ruby's dynamism, you know, people are able to create a lot of column names in a different, you know, creative ways, like meta programming and so on. So it's going to be hard to check in Ruby, particularly. But at least we can, in the documents, we can write this table name dot column name. And we know that it's always unique in the current application, you know, table name plus.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I was wondering if, like, there is a migration in this case where we add a column that sort of is ambiguous across related tables. So, right, so this MR added this column, and then there is other tables that relate to each other with foreign key constraints. And they also have similar columns, so the likelihood of having joins across them is quite high, I guess, with those foreign keys. Maybe that is something we can sort of, when you add that migration, we can sort of inform you that, oh, this is a column that is sort of ambiguous in the larger context. But I don't know if that is sort of, it's not that you would catch anything with that. It's just like an informational kind of thing.
That's true. You can just tell there are other tables who are using source type, for example, which is quite common. Mm-hmm. And then, and particularly, and this could be in very different MRs, like the person can, you know, have a first MR with report type introduced without any, you know, side effects. But in some dynamic filter, report type might be coming from two different tables. So, yeah, I think as Myra said, maybe we should have kind of a first check of like all possibilities.
Yeah, I was thinking of building like a reg task that lists the duplicated attributes across tables, and then use that source to feed a RuboCop rule, and then check like, okay, someone is adding an attribute, this one is already listed on the duplicated attributes, and there might be a chance if you use this attribute that the query is going to be like, it is not going to be very straightforward.
Yeah, I think it can be like from the information schema, it's quite straightforward to select all column names which are duplicates, you know. Yeah.
Just out of curiosity, is there a way, let's say I have a select statement which contains like columns without the table name, and if I call a plan on it, so I'm explaining it, would the explain automagically resolve the table name? Because if we always execute explain, then we can say that this query is actually using that specific table, and
yeah, particularly if the query is explicit, if it's not dynamically created by some, you know, combination of filters which may or may not be in that particular MR.
Are you saying we could? Sorry, go ahead.
I was thinking about, you know, comparing the output of the explain, which contains the tables and the columns that are queried, with the select statement in the basically in the pure SQL query before it's sent to the SQL server, and just matching that, hey, in the plan you have issues.userid, and in the SQL query you just have a user ID.
So when you explain that query, I think you would already run into the same problem because the reference is ambiguous, and that's why the
but this would happen before actually this problem. What I want to check is that in the select statement, you are explicitly passing in the table name and the column name. That's the only thing I want to check here. So if I get the explicit table name and column name from the plan, I can cross-check it with my query, which has only the column, and I can detect, hey, there is a mismatch here. The result is you forget to explicitly specify the table name.
Where would you get the plan from in this case?
So when the test runs, the queries are executed by active record. And in the test then, on the side, I would execute a second query just to grab the plan for each query. It's a bit hacky.
And in that sense, if I don't think it would have prevented the case that we had, wouldn't it? Like you would, in this case, you would basically run the migration that adds the new column, and then the code that got deployed afterwards had the same issue, right? It suffered from the ambiguity of the queries.
Actually not. That's the thing, that in the mr.deb code was already fixed this issue, so we didn't have a problem. Yeah, okay. That wouldn't help here.
I mean, if you have like ambiguity in your queries in local or in the tests that we run, then those tests will blow up because queries don't work.
And I think that's what happened. And the engineer fixed it. Of course, worked, test passed, and he thought it's done. Yeah, it's a tough one to detect.
Yeah, I guess what we can do is add to the documentation and make people aware, or as we review MRs, look for that. So if you see a custom SQL going on or a custom column names, then look for that, and we can see how many issues we run into before we tackle the more difficult detection of that.
Makes sense.
Okay. Shall we move on to the second point?
Yeah, the next one, it was from the previous session. So we had this performance issue about passing in huge arrays to active record, and that resulted in huge database queries. And we were discussing that, hey, maybe we should somehow detect these or at least limit or blow up when we detect, let's say, somebody passing in an array of 60,000 items to the active record query. And there is no way to limit the query size in Postgres. I think the limit is like 1 gigabyte or 2 gigabytes. I don't exactly remember. I checked a while ago. But it would be maybe interesting to see statistics about our query sizes, and maybe we can spot some, probably not a potential issue. And I was looking into Kibana, but it doesn't contain, or I don't have access to the queries, so I cannot really see them, what's being executed. And also on Grafana, I'm not quite familiar with it, so I don't know if you know somebody who can maybe help. It could be an interesting step to see that, maybe we have like crazy queries behind the scenes, and like what we run this Postgres checkup just doesn't catch it because it doesn't execute it that frequently.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm pretty sure we have these things going on quite a bit. So just if you pull up the log on one of the database machines, sometimes there is like patterns where you have like really long queries coming through. So yeah, definitely worth figuring that out or detecting that. You mentioned you didn't have access to Kibana and the logs.
So I was only able to see the Rails logs, and I noticed that there is a Postgres node, but yeah, I didn't see any data there.
Okay, I think if you have access to the Rails logs, you should also get the Postgres logs. I'll post a link on the agenda. Well, if that works, let me check. Probably want to share instead of just copying the link. All right. So when you go to Kibana, there's different indexes that we have, and if you want to see the Postgres ones, you will have to change the index. By default, we show the Rails logs, I think. Does that work for you?
Now, for some reason, it's working. When I selected Postgres, it didn't show anything.
Oh yeah, maybe there was some issue with it. And those are basically the full logs from the Patroni hosts, and that includes Postgres and the PG bouncers. What we don't do currently is we don't log each and every query. So it's not that you have the full log available in there, but we do log the queries that take longer than 1 second. And that is basically because we have so many queries going on, it would be really expensive to log all of these. But I guess it's sort of fair to say that if you have those issues where you put in like thousands of parameter values, then those might also take long. So maybe looking at those actually reveals these issues.
Okay, I will take a look. Thanks.
Cool, thank you. All right, Alper, unique index migration. I think you're muted. I think you're still muted.
Can I share my screen, Andreas?
Now I can hear you. Sure, go ahead.
Okay, Myra, actually, that's a database review which I passed on you because I was not, I didn't decide how to proceed. But I want to discuss here in the team. So there's an index for this table, which is software licenses like MIT or GPL. And currently there is no index on the name field, which is unique. And the MR wants to make this unique, this index, okay? And there are like 800 software licenses in gitlab.com, and 12 of them are duplicate, redundant. So the MR, which is here, the code is here, which I reviewed, practically first drops 12 duplicate values, reassigns them to the correct places, so gets rid of the duplication, removes the current index, and adds concurrently a new unique index, which is the same index, unique. Okay? Is the problem clear a bit? So my question is, I got like stuck in 3 questions which I cannot decide. This is a low traffic table, but it might be connected to a high traffic tables. So my question is, which I passed to Myra, is first, the data migration isn't reversible. Should I make this an issue as a reviewer? Fine. I mean, he's like basically out of 800 software licenses, by name, let's say there are 2 MIT licenses, and the query is deleting 12 of them, and it's irreversible. Should it be an issue in the review? Because in the documents, it's written that I have to have like reversible data migrations.
Yeah, thanks for asking. That is something I think we're currently discussing. We haven't made a good practice of requiring all the migrations to be reversible, but we're sort of in that discussion, figuring that out. Personally, I think the problem is when you migrate things and you lose that data. Obviously, you can make mistakes, and then you're basically don't have a way of recovering from those anymore. So that's why we suggest to make them reversible. I don't know if that is required here. What do others think about that? It's also obviously sort of a trade-off between the effort required and the benefits we get from that.
In this particular case, it's I think it's just a did application, and even if we revert the migration, after the did application, everything should be still operational, as far as I can see. So it wouldn't break the application, and there wouldn't be any data loss from the user point of view, I guess. I'm not sure if I understood correctly this the role of this table, but it's
the list of software licenses for I think license compliance, like.
So I guess we can look at the worst case that can happen. So let's say there is a bug in the migration where we were trying to deduplicate stuff and reassigning those, or removing the duplicates and making sure that the foreign keys are updated, and we're making a mistake, and we're basically maybe removing records that we didn't intend to remove or something like that. In that case, we would be in a very good situation when we can still reverse that and we still have the original table in place.
Yeah, in most cases, Andreas, it's quite difficult for the author to ensure a data migration reversibility in our context. And I would like to, in my experience, in some other past experience, we used to have a redundant table called migrations, which we would use as a temporary store. Like we would put there any data temporarily, and in case we are in trouble, this was a JSON-B table. In case we would need to revert it, we will just grab the data, kind of a. But currently in GitLab application, we don't have such a utility, so I'm unable to push this documentation restriction line.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that makes sense, and I guess that works well when you don't have a lot of data that you're dealing with, like in this case where there's 700 records or so. But things are different when you for example, when you drop a column on a large table, then you probably can't store that, or you wouldn't want to store that into a JSON or separate table.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's always a trade-off. What you could do here, if you really wanted to make it reversible, is to just copy the table before you change it. So this is relatively straightforward. You can do create table my backup, basically, and then just select from the original table. You don't need to have any indexes or stuff like that. You just copy the schema and the data, and then you migrate it, and then you're basically left with a backup of the original table that you may want to drop later when you know that the migration went fine. Maybe
in a future MR, you mean?
Yeah, sometime later. But then again,
okay.
you probably don't want to do that when you have gigabytes of data that you're migrating. It's always a trade-off.
Yeah. Okay. Let me jump to the second question. Maybe it's just the second question is, we have to disable transactions and have the concurrent index drop and add. Okay.
So, before that, Alper, can I ask a question about the migration?
Yes, please.
Do we need to reassign the duplicates before removing and adding the index?
Yes, because before adding the new index, we need to. Basically, otherwise the add concur index or add index or Postgres will fail with a, there are non-unique values. I cannot add this index error.
Yeah, it just worries me a little bit if the reassign duplicates method fails, then or it doesn't fail, and then the remove concurrent index fail. When we try to retry this migration, then we will be stuck, and the reassign duplicate is going to be executed again when it shouldn't. So
But
just
yeah.
that tiny part.
Real-time duplicate is a idempotent or idempotent, how do you pronounce it? So in that case, repeated runs of it will not make a problem. But I see two problems here. First, like, this is not transactional, this is a low traffic table, but let's think in the high traffic table, there might be other additions in the meantime in this current, up method, and the add current index can fail. And I saw one example in our post migrates where the person was trying 100 times attempting to run this retrying this up, and then logging like I couldn't do it at the end. And I put it in the MR. And the third, let me ask the third question and pass it to you. And the other question is that, like, this is a post migration, and the author also put here the uniqueness through active record, validation. And that was my doubt is here that, the code will be deployed with this name, presence, uniqueness true, and then later we shall have post migration or an index which ensures and 12 redundant records will be deleted. So what I'm afraid, can this code create problems, especially not maybe in this case, but in a high traffic scenario? Okay.
Mm-hmm. Very good questions. So
sorry for if they are little like they are useless. I passed it to Myra actually. So for maintainer DB, because also the authors usually, I don't want to bug them with infinite, requests for little tables, like only 800 software licenses finally.
No, I think it makes sense to talk about that. I mean, what we don't want to have is those simple migrations to fail a deployment, because that puts the burden on our delivery team to figure out what's going on and then revert those. So it's definitely worth talking about that and making sure that this is consistent. Maybe I can summarize how maybe that concept works together with the unique constraint and or the unique validation in Rails and the unique constraint index. So what you can do, we basically have 3 stages where you can run a regular migration with the old code that is live currently. Then you update the code, and your application has both the new schema and the new code running. And then at some time later, you run the post-deploy migration, right? And in this case, what we do is we have a post-deploy migration that makes this index unique in the end, or this is the goal of that migration, right? And like you said, this migration has to be non-transactional in that sense, that you can't wrap that into a transaction because you want to benefit from the concurrent index creation, so that's not an option. And now what can happen, and you already pointed that out, is you have this code that basically removes the duplicates and reassigns foreign keys. And then only later, and without a transaction going on, we remove the existing index, and then we create a new unique index. And there is a window of time when things are still ongoing and those duplicates are still going to be produced, that when you arrive at the index creation, you still have duplicates because they came in after you were cleaning up. And the only way that I can see to prevent that is that you have to teach the application to not have those duplicates, or not introduce those duplicates anymore, right? And I think that adding this uniqueness validation is actually the right way of doing that, because then you make sure that the application that is running while you execute the post deploys doesn't produce any new duplicates coming in. You run the cleanup in the post deploy, and at this point in time, you can be sure that there are no more duplicates coming in, and you can just change the index. What I wasn't sure about is when you add this validation, I think it also applies to any updates that you make to existing records, and that might be a problem depending on how those updates look like.
Andreas, sometimes I don't know exact details, but sometimes in a related table you save, and just it's like it's connected to the software licenses table. Even in that save, there are checks for validations, which suddenly, you know, but I didn't test this particularly in this case, like how it works, or is there such a table, or you know.
Yeah. So what could happen is that you deploy the code change, you have this unique validation in place, and then until you add the unique index and remove the duplicates, maybe the update functionality is broken for the user, because when you try to save, then there is a duplicate now, and I can't deal with that until you remove the duplicate, right? I don't know if that is a problem here.
So should we include the uniqueness validation on the model or not? Like there is a slight chance yeah, I am not sure. Because there is a slight chance that someone is updated at the same time while the migration is being executed, and then that is going to be a problem. But it shouldn't be like a small amount of time, and then suddenly everything is going to be okay because the migration is already executed. But I don't know.
And do we know exactly how many minutes passes from code deploy to post deployment migration? Is it like literally seconds or minutes or free anytime? I don't know the automation there. But
I don't have the exact timing, but this is sort of the post deploy is the step that is currently being executed after the code change happens. Although I think we're also discussing to delay, or there have been discussions about delaying this the post deploy migrations quite a lot. So guess it's good to not make any assumptions about that.
That's the whole idea of post deploy migration, is running it as late as possible. Yeah.
Right. Speaking of risks, maybe so what we could do to reduce the risk of these updates to fail until we arrive at the post deploys, to if we had a regular migration that was already cleaning up the duplicates, that is something you can do, right? You can have a regular migration that is already removing the existing duplicates. Then you add the uniqueness validation, and in this case, you're not totally sure there are no duplicates anymore in the database, but you just ran the step that was removing the existing one. So there's only a tiny window of time where you might have additional duplicates. That doesn't keep you from running the cleanup step in the post deploy, because you want to be sure that you don't have any more in this case. But it may reduce the risk of causing those updates to fail because of the existing duplicates. Does it make sense? Or?
Yeah, I think makes sense. Myra, I also linked a previous post migration who really took this literally to the limit by checking 100 attempts, and finally reporting we give up because index unification because of duplicates, something like that. Literally. I also don't know how to, like, this is not this may be a low traffic table. Should we enforce such policies too hard or too low, because then the author could feel like it's a little issue sometimes behind the feature flag, and we don't have a bigger picture of sometimes exactly what's happening except asking the author.
Yeah, that's often my problem too. I'm not really familiar with all the domains we have. I just have two more thoughts on this. You mentioned on the MR that you didn't have access to the database, or was it the author of that, the MR?
Who, me or?
Yeah.
I think he said, but then I counted. I mean, I put the number of software licenses and the related table in the description, the count of like that there are 12 only duplicates. You know.
All right. So you do have access to a database replica to investigate?
I don't, but I'm using others. I have a problem with infrastructure. They couldn't put my name correctly. Still, I'm fighting.
Oh, okay. Okay. So I guess what I was getting at is that you should have database access.
No, I have. Without data, a lot of things are dependent on the data, and without data, making meaningful, sensible comments is impossible. Otherwise, and you don't understand if there is 7 million or like just 700 licenses. You know, it's like without it.
Right, and then some of these things you can figure out with Database Lab or ChatOps or something like that. But then when you want to look at this distributions or stuff like that, it's really helpful to have that database access. Okay. Other thing I wanted to point out, it's a very minor issue with this migration is we're basically replacing an index, and the more straightforward way of doing that is removing the index and then creating a new one. But knowing that, again, this is not transactional, and also the index creation can fail, it may leave you in a state where you don't have any index anymore for some time, you know. And that's always the case. Even if things go well, that's always the case between, you know, removing the index and creating that, because the creation can actually take a while. So what I tend to suggest is to check if we can just flip the order of that. So you first create a new index with a different name, and then remove the old one when you're done. That's not as convenient because you have to specify the name, but it's sort of it's usually easy to do, and you don't end up in a situation, although it's unlikely to happen, but it's still not great, I guess.
So you say we reassign, create a new index with a new name, and then drop the old index with the old name.
Exactly, yeah.
Cool. No question, we can skip to the... Anyway, I passed it to Myra, so sorry, Myra. I was like, you know, it's hard to make, because when you read the documentation, you have to be very strict, but real life is like, you know, you don't want to finally... Also, I'm in the very opposite time zone with the author, so it becomes very difficult, and Myra is closer now. That's going to be easier. I think he's in Hawaii or something. Okay, I'm not sure. Like, okay.
Okay.
Next.
I don't have like a particular thing I want to dive into, but I wanted to link to a discussion that is really interesting, and it's also similar to what we talked before here. It's about like migrations that relate to larger tables or heavier use tables, and how we can deal with those exclusive locks. And sometimes that's really subtle. We've talked about that before, where you drop an empty table and that has a foreign key constraint to a heavily used one, and that causes a problem. I think the discussion is really interesting. And there is a proposal to retry with low lock timeouts. That is interesting, and currently I find it very interesting to talk about the lock queue problems, even though it's maybe not as relevant, because I think the retries is actually a good step to take. It's probably fixing most of the things for us. Still, the discussion is quite interesting. I just wanted to point that out if you're interested in diving into that.
Andreas, I was thinking that one and another discussion in the same time. Look, we had this huge Java project import within a single transaction. Think of this one, and now that drop. What if they come together in related tables? Like on one side you have a day-long transaction, on the other side you have a attempt to drop some related table, so or something like that.
Yeah, absolutely. I think what's really worth to keep in mind is that the statement timeout is really good that we have. So you can only run up to 15 seconds with your query, but on the other hand, you're free to basically run the transaction until whatever when you finish that. So there is no limit to that, and apparently we have those as well. So totally right. And that the retries in that sense, if you have that going on the sides, if there is a really long transaction, retries are not going to like help with that situation. And yeah, I think we're currently also on a really urgent customer issue to fix the import problem. And it sounds like we should be cutting those transactions down because of that as well. And for the retries, what I found interesting is that when you basically the problem is when you enqueue your DDL statement and you basically ask to get that exclusive lock, then you already block any other requests that are coming in after you. So because of this lock queue, and as soon as there is a request for an exclusive lock, then any other requests for locks coming in are going to be blocked because of that, and that's why you want to use a really low lock timeout, so that you don't end up, even though you don't get the lock, that you don't end up blocking others while you wait for that lock. And my understanding is that the retries are not going to improve that situation. So when you retry, you're not in a better spot than before. So you have a better statistical chance of succeeding in the end, but because of the amount of retries. But it's not a systematically better situation for those retries.
And just because you wait in the queue, you block legitimate web requests. That's the, yeah.
Exactly.
And what is the solution now? Where is it going? I mean, this discussion with Yorick, and you know, do you have any like?
I'm not sure where we end up. To be honest, I think the retries are good on its own, because when we have simple things like adding a column, you already acquire an exclusive lock on that table, or you attempt to do that. And today that basically means that any requests that are coming in while you wait for that lock are going to be blocked, and that might end up blocking requests for 15 seconds. And that is something I would already consider a hiccup when you try to use our site and things stall for 15 seconds. So that's a problem. And I think that's why we should get the lock timeout in place, so that we control the amount of time that you can spend in the lock queue to get that lock. However, that also reduces the likelihood of you actually getting or succeeding to get that lock. So you want to retry that quite a lot. And ultimately, I think what you're asking from the delivery team's perspective is that what do we do when we don't succeed with those migrations? And I don't have a clear answer to that at the moment.
I think we need a chatops command to check and retry, maybe something like that. Start the hopeless retries again. Check, retry.
But we have to think about, the self-hosted one, self-hosted installations. So it's not just GitLab.com, but might other customers run into these issues as well.
Yeah.
So it's a tricky one.
We give them a reg task too.
Yeah, maybe something like an administrative panel where they can, do these optimizations or, trigger some scheduled items. But yeah, that's a long way, I guess.
I think customer self-hosted instances are lucky that we are running the GitLab.com, which is I think always bigger than any customer installation. So we face more challenging problems and solve it.
Yeah, that's true. I think it's also worth to separate two types of migrations. I think there's the ones that we discuss, for example, like dropping tables, dropping foreign key constraints and these kind of things. That is something you can easily delay and say like, oh yeah, I want that to get done at some point, but I don't care when that happens. So we might just easily do that in the background during weekends or whatever. We don't really care about it. And then on the other hand, a migration like adding a column, that is something you can't delay. You will have to do that with your deploy, because as soon as you deploy the code change, you want that column, so it has to happen. And even those, they like we discussed, they require exclusive locks, and they may actually suffer from the same problems.
I mean, you can put the feature that you are developing behind a feature flag. So then the code is not executed until the migration is finished in the background. But yeah, that's who knows when it will be executed. So maybe we released that point 12.6, and in the next release we automatically successfully adding the column, and a feature just enable itself. So it's not that reliable.
Yeah.
I mean, what disturbs me in all this is that we are in a precise discipline, computer science, we are moving to a quantum state, which is like everything. So you are not sure that the migration took place, which is due to high traffic, which is really, some
Yeah.
bad conclusion, or let's say.
Yeah. And also now we can say, if we say 12.5 has this exact schema for all the installations, and then if we introduce this background migrations, we might have different schemas all over the installation. So yeah, this is a tricky problem.
Yeah, it comes with a lot of complexity when you don't control the state anymore. What has also come up in that discussion is that ultimately the problem that we suffer from is the high traffic on some of those tables. For example, namespaces or projects or users. Those are large tables, and also wide tables that have a lot of traffic, and that's why we have those problems. And if we split those down into like multiple more narrow tables, that's a good practice anyways, and we basically we'd be able to, we probably have tables that don't get the same amount of traffic as the original ones, and then adding a column to those becomes easier because you don't have this, or that high level of traffic anymore. On the other hand, you still have this original table that you use to reference a user, for example. That probably doesn't, it may only contain like user ID, username, and one of the core user attributes. And you still, from all those other tables that you split it from the original table, you still reference the original table. And if you add another table that is sort of referencing the original table, then you still have that problem, because you then add a foreign key constraint pointing to this table, and you still need an exclusive lock for that. So the problem goes away for quite a few things, I guess, where you add columns to the other tables that don't have a lot of traffic, but you still suffer from the same problem as soon as you touch the original table that has a lot of traffic. So no ultimate way of getting rid of that problem.
Yeah.
There was this article from GitHub that they are not really do foreign keys anymore.
Mm-hmm.
Do we consider something like that, not for the core tables, but let's say a special feature a new feature that we develop, and basically we don't really need referential integrity if we are deleting a project or a repository. It's okay if records are staying around for a while in the other tables, and a regular job can actually clean those out.
I think this is a little bit controversial topic as well. I guess You also get a lot of benefits from having foreign key constraints, because you don't have to care about the consistency and clean things up and deal with broken relationships. And if you can manage to remove those, I think there's you probably still be able to cope with that, but you have to sort of be able to cope with that from the application side, and that adds complexity as well. I wouldn't be like removing all the foreign key constraints that we have, because we really benefit from those, right? And we don't have any ways of dealing without, or of handling those consistency issues without them at the moment.
Andreas, do you think, or Adam, is there a size beyond which, like, let's say 100 million users, beyond which foreign key constraints would be impossible in this context? Like some larger scale, like say 1 billion user, let's say, or 100 million user. Do you think there's a size where you cannot enforce some database? I mean, I'm asking the same question with a higher number of, you know. What do you think about it?
I mean, obviously, the more users you have, the higher the traffic gets, and then you suffer a lot more from those issues that we just discussed. So that is an obvious problem. Performance-wise, I think as soon as you have like billions of users, you're going to do things a lot differently, and you may also not want to have single large tables anymore like we do today, right? You probably don't want to stick those billion users into one user's table anymore. So there is you may want to do that differently. And yeah, foreign key probably something that you also want to consider. But if you ask me about like what the performance impact is, it really depends on what you're doing. Generally, the validating foreign keys is something that when you have a supporting index, that is the same as basically querying based on that index, performance-wise. It becomes a problem when you insert large amounts of data, when you when you have large batches of inserts. But there is ways of dealing with that as well, where you basically want to disable the foreign key constraints until you're done, and then you validate those in the end. Yeah. Cool. We are over time, but we can still. So there's 2 points. Ben, he's not on the call anymore, but he apparently is the support stable counterbot for database group. That's great. And he'll introduce himself next time. And Mara, you asked about the database training.
Yeah, just making sure I didn't miss like anything while I was on vacation. Not sure if it was started or if it is still planned, or I don't know if someone knows anything.
Yeah, no, it's not started. We've reached out to vendors. Craig reached out recently, and we are still waiting for some responses and trying to figure out which of those we're going to get. I think that's at least my state of mind there. So you didn't miss anything. It's still coming up. It's still planned. It's just that we don't have decided yet.
Thanks.
Sure. All right, cool. Then let's call it. Thanks for the chat. It was really good chatting today. Appreciate it.
Bye, everyone.
And
thanks. Bye.
Have a nice day. Bye-bye.